Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, all, and thank you for joining Vee and I today for this presentation where 50 game designers got their ideas for Big Bad Con Online 2023. Today, we'll be talking about the ideas and inspiration behind some games you may have heard of and what we can learn from their excellent designers to help you get ideas and move forward with your own games. But before we get to that, we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are presenting, the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging.
So, welcome to this talk. If we haven't met before, I'm Vee Hendro. This is Hayley Gordon, and we make games. We've made Good Society, a Jane Austen RPG, Fight with Spirit, a sports drama RPG, and many others. And one of the things that I think we as game makers and role players, whenever we pick up a new game, one of the things that we're super always curious about is like how that thing came to be. What was that spark that allowed that game to come into the world? And so that's kind of the basis of this talk today, was basically us stating our own curiosity, where we asked like 50 published gaming creators 2 questions. Like, these are the specific questions that we asked them. Question 1, looking back, where do you think you got the very first tiny spark of the idea for your game? What was it, a particular moment, a mechanic you were interested in tinkering with, a dream you had? Tell us all about it. And then question 2, which was, like, what did you do with that? What caused you to make the choice to pursue that idea further and make it into a role-playing game? Why that particular idea and not another one? And these are questions that like we interrogate for our own games a lot of the time too. And we're always like, so it's always so interesting. And I'm so happy that we got a wide range of responses for this survey. And in this talk, we're going to kind of go through what we found and any trends and patterns and that sort of thing. There are some awesome things that we can learn from each other's practice, and there's some awesome takeaways that I think will help you with your own game making practice. And here, I think the next slide is sort of like the plan for today. We're going to talk a little bit about inspiration, just generally speaking, what it is, what does it do, what are we talking about in this talk? And then we're going to go through that first question that's about ideas and where we get them from. And then we're going to talk about question 2, which is about why that particular idea, what motivated different game designers to take their ideas forward, before we do a wrap up. And then we'll do questions at the end. So if you do think of a question, like write it down or drop it in chat, and we'll get through the questions at the end of the talk. We'll leave like 10 minutes for questions at the end. So yeah, jot your question down so you don't forget it. But one more thing before we do just jump into it is that I'd like to thank all of the game makers who took the time and the effort to sort of participate, give us their responses. We will have slides throughout the rest of this presentation, which has a feature of the games and credits, so you can look them up afterwards. We will be going through them quite a bit quickly because there's a lot of them to go through in this time. So if you want to, you can always rewatch or pause this to check them all out slowly. So yeah, so that's the plan today. Let's jump into it.
So to start off, what is inspiration? So academics Thrash and Elliott created a tripartite conceptualization of inspiration, which breaks it down to 3 steps. And the steps that they identified are evocation, transcendence, and approach motivation. These sound like big words, but essentially what this means is that they really broke inspiration down into 1, taking note of something, 2, contemplating its possibilities, and then 3, deciding to do something with these possibilities. And these line up really well with the responses that we receive from the designers. So, for example, when making Masks of the Mummy Kings, Nathan D. Pauletta took note of the game Swords Without Masters, thought about the possibility of that mechanical framework, and then decided to do something with it, namely to use it to make a game about delving into long-lost tombs. Similarly, for Kiana Shaw, with the game Heaven Nor Hell, took note of the show Good Omens and the way it presented the evolution of relationships, and then used this idea as the basis for the game about the relationship between immortal beings. So from this perspective, inspiration really has 2 vital parts: being inspired by and being inspired to. Inspired by links closely with our first question, what inspired this game? And inspired to links to the second question. So what caused you to pursue this particular idea and get it to be the one that becomes the completed game? So these divisions between inspired by and inspired to aren't always clear cut. And in many cases, it took multiple inspired bys to reach the inspired to. But this combination of sort of multiple or single inputs and then eventually contemplation and action is universal. And that seems to be the process from which inspiration is made. So you can think about the rest of our talk as really being divided between these two sections, inspired by and inspired to, because both of these are necessary to create something new.
Yeah, so here we go. So we're going into ideas and what are game designers inspired by, and where do we get our ideas from? Unsurprisingly, we are inspired by many things. So let me explain this slide a little bit. When we went through our survey, we found that most of the respondents fell into some general categories of what they said they were inspired by. Things like fictional media, other games, that's video games, role-playing games, board games, any kind of game-like experiences, something they were passionate or obsessed about, personal experience, lived experiences that they've been through themselves, or a couple of them, there's this idea of they thought of a mechanic for a game, a mechanical idea. They didn't really know what to do with it, but that's what it started from, this mechanical idea. So these buckets, these sources, we found that most people, 38% only mentioned one of these things in their response. That doesn't mean that they weren't more. It was just the one that they felt they needed to say about, like, that's where it came from. But a majority said 2 or 3. So more people definitely drew on various kinds of things in their being inspired by. So 48% there mentioned 2 different sources, and by sources I mean these categories of things, and 24% mentioned 3 different kinds of things. So I think what this tells us is that we as game designers look for ideas in many, many different kinds of places, and often it's actually the combination of various ideas from all these various things combined that make the best inspirations for the games that we end up making. So as we're moving forward in this talk, we're going to be talking about these particular categories and some specific game examples to illustrate them. But while we are doing that, keep in mind that those games might also have been inspired by other things, that we aren't just that they're more 2 or 3, more likely to have 2 or 3 other things that they're also drawing on. So let's jump into the first one, which is the fictional media, which is an unsurprising category. I think we know fictional media is often an inspiration for us. It's super popular. 30% of surveyed designers drew from fictional media. 53 of those, 34%, 53% drew from books, 41 from screen media, so movies, TVs, animes, animations, and 6% from music, including songs, song lyrics, and other musical things. I think with this was actually surprising to me that books outdid screen media. I think that was quite surprising to me, and I think speaks to a lot to how much role players do love reading books. So there's a couple of different ways I think that fictional media is used. So the first things, one of them is that designers sometimes wanted to replicate the specific kinds of story they saw in other media, like Flabbergasted, which was inspired by the TV show Jeeves and Wooster. Our own game, Good Society, was also obviously trying to replicate the storytelling in Jane Austen novels specifically. And other times, the thinking about books or movies allows designers to actually just like spark a related idea to that thing. And it's not about replicating the media. So for example, Leo Chung of Parslings had just read a couple of fantasy novels and was discussing these with his wife in a cinema while waiting for the movie to start. And that's what led to this game. That was like the first thing about making that. And another example is The Slow Knife, which was Jack Harrison. It's a revenge-focused game centered on villains and their inevitable downfall. So I don't think you'll be surprised when I say that this was inspired by a rereading of The Count of Monte Cristo. But it's not always that. So I guess from these last two examples, it's not just reading the book or watching the movie that sparks the idea. Maybe sometimes it is, but oftentimes it's also that these designers are engaging in those ideas a bit more deeply than that, either by going and discussing it with someone, or by rereading the novel, like reading it again and pulling out observations from it, and really thinking through those things. So you can make this kind of engagement with fictional media a kind of habit. And I think this is a wonderful quote from Ray, who said, for Apocalypse Keys, "In this case, I was reading the Hellboy comic, and like my brain usually does, I started to break down what the narrative would look like as a TTRPG unfolding at a table between players. This happens when I watch movies, read books, and so on." So I do think that for a lot of us game designers, this kind of thinking is somewhat instinctual, but making this kind of active analysis of other fictional media as you're consuming it is really good thought exercises, and makes, like, doing that as a strong habit will make you a better game designer and develop your skills. But it's potentially a great way of inspiring your next game. So this is one of the biggest, I guess, sources of inspiration.
Moving on to our next source of inspiration, other games. So more than 36% of the designers we surveyed were inspired by other games, whether they be, most of them were tabletop role-playing games, so the same kind of game they were making, but video games and board games were also mentioned. And of those who drew on these games, exactly half were inspired by the theme or the play experience, so the fictional content really of the game, and the other half were inspired by a particular mechanic or kind of mechanic. And where the mechanics sort of came into play is that for several designers, existing role-playing games provided a mechanic that matched with a theme that they had in mind, such as in the case of Rest in Pieces. Or the experience of the mechanic caused them to imagine a theme that fits in, like in the case of A Complicated Profession. So where you have something that you're working on, where there's a theme that's resonant with you, the mechanic that you need to start the journey of bringing that game to life might come from another role-playing game. But just as much, playing other role-playing games might expose you to kind of mechanics that make you think of themes that fit them. And that later example is exactly what happened in the case of designer Alex Roberts, who created Starcrossed after being inspired by the role-playing game Dread. And Alex said of this experience that Dread used the tower to generate the perfect atmosphere for the horror genre. But I thought the scariest thing in the world is having a crush on someone, right? So very much the mechanic of the game giving rise to the idea of the theme that matched with it and starting that way around. Designers can also be inspired by the theme of the game, as mentioned earlier, such as the Battlestar Galactica board game, which helped inspire Last Fleet. And even we found that occasionally they were inspired by a game that was almost what they imagined, but didn't quite hit the spot, which is how Dragons and Traveler's Tales got its beginnings, when the creator read Ryutama and was like, that's almost there, but not quite. So unsurprisingly, we get a lot of inspiration from other games, other role-playing games, but looking widely at other kinds of games is also helpful as well. And you never know in what part of consuming that experience might give rise to an idea. The next category or source of inspiration that we found people had was mechanical ideas. So 20% of designers had a particular game mechanic sort of going around in their head that they wanted to build this game around. And they longed to get this idea to the table, but they just really needed a theme, that fit with it or that would go with it. And in a lot of cases, these mechanical ideas were loosely or indirectly inspired by the games, but often not to the degree that we saw in the games category. Yeah, this might be something that there was many other games that they were sort of just consuming at the time that gave rise to this particular mechanic, or something that they tangentially bounced off. For example, the game Firelights began when the designer was playing a lot of video games. And the video games, not directly, but through their consumption, sort of caused the designer to think about the idea of challenge cards that could form a map for later exploration. And in terms of the other thing that we found was that the mechanical idea that starts this thread isn't always the one that ends up making it into the game. But despite that, it can still be a great source of inspiration when you start following it down the rabbit hole. And that was the case in the game Anamnesis by Samantha Lee, which started from the idea of a blank character sheet. And that concept itself never actually made it into the game, but it still provided that first spark. For the designers that started off thinking with a mechanical idea, we found that often they had been ruminating on that mechanical idea for quite a while before it eventually made its way into game form, longer than it seemed from designers who were inspired by other categories. So longer than, for example, those who had taken their inspiration from media. The creator of Exquisite Biome, Cairo Assertion, said that of a mechanic in this game, that the idea of cycling cards always stuck with me, tucked away in a back pocket. And I think that describes that idea really well. The mechanic that's just like a little itch, you might come back to it from time to time, but you don't quite know what to do with it. And then one day the pieces sort of fit together. And some creators, like the creator of the Slow Knife, Jack Harrison, described having an aha moment when things finally sorted themselves out.
Which is the opposite of this next category, which is the biggest category, and one of the ones that I can think resonated with me the most was passion and obsession. For 40% of designers, part of their inspiration for their game was a passion or obsession, something they just couldn't stop thinking about. So unlike the idea of, I guess, the back pocket where you've got an part of an idea and you tuck it away until it all falls into places, these passion and obsession ones sometimes went a different way, where it's the thing that's consuming the front of their mind as much as possible, and they just ran with it because they couldn't stop thinking about it. So firstly, I think designers who really wanted to make a certain type of game, and they were just waiting for it all to come together, but they've always had this type of game that they wanted to bring into the world. That was about 20% of all the survey designers had that vision that they wanted to be moving towards. So Sebastian, for example, wanted to make a game about the events that followed a cataclysmic moment, and that became the Lake of Secrets. And Sen-Fung Lim, working with Banana Chan, wanted to make a game about Chinese people by Chinese people, and that was for anyone who wanted to engage with the culture in a fun and positive way. And that became Jiangxi, but in the banquet hall. So in those cases, they had a very strong idea of what they wanted to do. And then they put together the rest of the game in line with that vision, passion, that passionate thing that they wanted to pursue. So on the other side of passion, the thing they're passionate about and want to bring into the world is this obsession or rumination side of things, this sticky idea that we kind of don't know why, but we keep coming back to over and over again. Or sometimes maybe we know why, but they're there. And eventually they shape themselves into something that becomes game-like. In fact, so 10% of designers even mentioned, I think, the words being obsessed by or obsession in their responses. So it was number one word that repeated over and over again. And in our reading of those responses, it was clear that, those thoughts kept coming back to them until they found an outlet for it, until they found the thing that they could do with that. And they, in most cases, were searching for that. So, for example, one of these ones was Gubat Banwa, which came out of the obsession with the cultures of pre-colonial Philippines and Southeast Asia in general. And then Hannah Schaefer said of Public Guest 5, it was inspired by a dream, and we both thought it was so specific and surreal, we couldn't stop imagining that world. And then this game came out of it. So sometimes it's the things that we are passionate and obsessed about, you kind of just go with the flow. That's where the most inspiration is going to be found, because you're already thinking about it. Why not? So the next one, no, it's not the last one. It's the second last one that we're going to talk about in this section of the talk, is personal experience. And this is more than 20% of designers' game ideas came from their own personal, like lived experiences, or in a few cases, we also included games that had someone had a personal connection to an idea or a concept, and this was a pretty interesting category, I think, because this category was the most broad in that it defies any sort of like patterns or trends, because it's so personal to each individual game designer. It's based on their particular life rather than any like fictional ideas, any genre like fantasy, or it's very individual, and so it can be really unique. I think it was the most interesting category in some ways because it kind of shows how strong a voice game designers can have in terms of what they're interested about, what they want to, what they've experienced in their life, and how that all comes together in sort of a role-playing game / a work of art as a work of self-expression. So this was really cool. Some games in this, as illustrations of this category, were from kind of broader personal experiences, such as connection to culture, but some were really specific. Like this next one, The Sun's Ransom. Pidge Renson had a really specific moment of the sweltering and oppressive heat of the Australian summer, which is hot. And in Terence's words it was 40 degrees, that's Celsius, with no aircon, and I was on the couch with a foot in a bucket of water because I couldn't sleep. And in that frustrated, partial wakefulness, I had this idea of vampires working to bring back the sun. And that's it's such a cool way for a game to begin. I think you like I said, it defies patterns or trends. It's sort of like a thing that happened to someone and a moment. And another, so those were really cool. And some of the other ones in this were, actually a couple of them had, the one pattern that we found from recent ones were from the pandemic. Obviously, that was a big thing that the whole world, we all went through. And that also led to kind of a shared experience around that. And a couple of designers wanted to their own counter narratives of hope to the pandemic times. And these included games like Monster Care Squad by Sandy Pug Games, to Amending by Xing Yin Ko, who said, it's wonderful, being parted from so many dear friends led to a very natural narrative of traveling to see a friend, and in a sense, their game was a love letter to all the people I couldn't physically be near anymore. And that's so beautiful and reflects how our own experiences as humans and as people can lend their voice to the games we make.
So this last source of inspiration I call Do It to Do It. And this is the category of responses from designers that flipped the script of inspiration entirely. So rather than something inspiring them and then them getting going, 16% of designers simply began making, and they kind of worked out the content of what it was they were making as they went. And that is because something else prompted or got them to get going. And as they started that creation process, something about their own ideas struck them, providing the seed of inspiration for the full game to come. So The Score and Justica both started from an external request or prompt. And Court of Blades was originally written for a friend who dreamed of a game centered on intrigue and scheming, and a quick version was finished in about a week to get it to the table on time. And Logan, an autobiographical game, started as a response to a Twitter trend, writing one move every day for a month. So in the case of these designers, it was simply the need to respond to external stimuli that prompted them to fit all the ideas together in their brain and make something. And the something that they created was, in pretty much all these cases, pretty far from what the actual final game was, but the content of the thing that they created held enough promise or enjoyment for them to continue to pursue that. So that's all our sources of inspiration, all our sources of inspiration too. So what can we learn from all of these amazing responses that we got from these designers and from the sparks that brought their projects into being? Well, firstly, there was a big theme of staying curious and following your sense of what is fascinating. So do chase the rabbits down the holes. You're only going to get stuck in that hole if there's something there worth getting stuck on. And I'm sure that all of you have heard the expression, write what you know. But based on our survey, it's more like write what you're obsessed with, right? So our survey suggests that the closer the input is to the self, the more likely we are to have it on the top of our minds to draw from, to make connections with. And the closer the idea is to the self, the more our brain looks for connections in the world around us. We kind of scan for other inputs so that we can finally make it into a workable idea because it's something that we're constantly thinking about. And as we mentioned before, for 20% of designers, that personal lived experience was vital, but an input doesn't have to be personal to the self to be close to the self. So our experiences aren't just limited to those that take place in the physical world. Every time we read, watch, or play something new, we are adding to our catalog of experiences. And we know this because we're RPG creators, right? We play lots of RPGs. And in particular, when we play role-playing games, we indulge in that kind of play that interrogates the self and connects deeply to our emotions and creates a human experiences all of its own, right? We know that the experiences we have when we role play are real experiences, even though the events that happen are fictional. And so it's not surprising, to find that these things that we're obsessed with, even if they're not part of lived experience, can be really close to the self and can, drive our games forward and provide these sources of inspiration. And for that reason, our obsession with media or with a world or setting or with an emotion, these are all valuable starting points for a game. And, from the personal experience of a sweltering day to a love of Jeeves and Wooster, there are no bad places to find inspiration. There are no activities that lack value if they're approached with an open mind. So that was one thing that really came out of the responses to the first question. The second one is that if you find something you like, take a bit of time to stew in it. Even if it's not ready yet, even if it's only a fraction of that thing, you can tuck it in your back pocket, as Karo said, and take it out and ruminate on it every so often. And you might be surprised by the way that it eventually turns into an idea. And this is actually backed up by neuroscience research, I believe it is. So as humans, we are kind of made to daydream, kind of. Author David Beres notes that neuroscientists have theorized that this is kind of the brain's default state, the state that the brain is when it's not focused on a task. And when it's in this state, it's building mental simulations based on past experiences. It can be imagining the future or envisioning different perspectives and scenarios. And these drifty, random thoughts are where creative thinking seems to happen. So being open to what your own mind presents you is more important than engaging in the conscious activity of trying to find good ideas in order for that inspiration to happen and that game to get underway. So that's what we got out of part 1. So let's move on to part 2.
Yes. Actually, to part 3.
To part 3. Thank you.
Motivation.
Let's move on from question 1. Let's move on to question 2.
Yeah, the question 2 of the survey,
question
which is
2
confusingly part 3 about
part 3.
Who numbered these? Which is about motivation. What gets us from idea to game? So far we've talked about all the things that games designers are inspired by, but as we're all too aware, most ideas don't end up making it to a final product, or are still tucked away in our back pocket. That's fine. That maybe someday their time will come. But in our second question, we wanted to find out what made designers pursue their ideas to the end. And I think before I want to talk about the responses that we got themselves, I want to talk a bit about inspiration and perspiration, which I think many of us have heard this famous quote. It was attributed to Thomas Edison: "Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration." And I think this quote, people often say it to mean that like having a good idea is just like one small tiny fraction of the process of creating something, and then making that thing or making that idea, bringing it into the world, is actually the big and hard part. And like that is true, but I think it overlooks one of the most important key functions of inspiration, which is that when we are inspired, we are not only inspired by things, but we are inspired to do something. And that kind of inspiration to action actually is what turns ideas into obsessions. And as game designers, I think a lot of the times what we're accountable to is mostly ourselves. There's no one else like kind of pushing that on us. We are making our games ourselves, and are only accountable to ourselves. And so motivation becomes very, very, very important. And I think the strength of our inspiration / motivation needs to be strong enough to carry us emotionally through that 99% that is the hard work, right? That part of the inertia of starting a project, the hard yards of trying to play test it and making it work, and all of that part of it is that I guess what I'm trying to say is like the more inspiration we have, the more perspiration we are capable of. So in that sense, I think inspiration deserves more than that 1% credit, although most of it is hard work. That being inspired can allow us to work hard. So that's I think the importance of this part of the talk. And in our survey, we found kind of 4 main motivations that help these creators take their idea, that spark of an idea, and fan it into flames into what is the burning fire of their awesome game. You will see that some of them kind of take resonate with the same themes. So the first one being obsession and excitement are key. And this was one of the most important ones. 52% of creators harnessed either obsession or excitement to help them move forward through their project. As we said, obsession kind of can be the first things that we are inspired by, but it's even, I think, more important in this part. Catherine and Hakan said of their game Xeno Language, we felt like our excitement and conviction would carry us through the ups and downs of what it takes to make games. And Jason Morningstar said of creating role-playing games, multiple, this is how I express myself, and many of my games emerge from captivating ideas or concerns I have. And I think the most common form of excitement and obsession was sort of the love or resonance of a theme or mechanic. And I think we've seen this a lot so far in how people have talked about their games, but you can't underscore enough how this part actually does sustain the game making process itself. So to be really in love with your game and your idea, be really obsessed with the themes that resonate most to you, or the things about your game that resonate most to you, is a wonderful way to keep yourself motivated throughout the entire game design process. So I think another quick quote from J.K. Savdira of Gubert Balnois was that it was an intoxicating passion. Like, that's the level of obsession we want to have with our own games. Designers that allowed themselves to follow their flights of fancy and indulgement in order to feed the fire of the ideas kind of got a lot out of it. So in the survey results, we found that one way to maximize excitement and obsession is through connection with other people. 32% of creators mentioned connection with others as something that buoyed them through the process. I think that makes a lot of sense, because other people being involved and excited about ideas can really help us feel like it's a real thing. I think one of the most cool thing that we learned from the responses is about early playtests. So 12% of games, the fun and promise of early playtests was specifically mentioned, including in Arc by Mementos and Quietus by Ollie Jeffrey. Both of those responses specifically mentioned early playtesting and how much that helped them. So I think that highlights a really key point in time where you've got an idea, you want to turn that into a game, and you've made a playtest. That playtest going in a way that is exciting or supportive to you can really, really help you through the rest of the process. Kind of sets the tone for the rest of your playtesting or game making. Not always, but like it's definitely something to think about, setting up an early playtest for express purpose of hyping yourself for that game project, I think. So the other thing that came up in this section is collaborating with other people or connecting with a wider RPG community, probably mostly online, but also in physical form, in the physical real world. What is that? Hello, everyone, in Big Fat Con online. Yeah, so that's another part of this, connecting with other people. And then the last part of connecting with others is just even the dream or future, like thinking about other people playing your game and finding it fun or valuable to them. And so a lot of 10% of designers, including 1,000-year-old vampire creator Tim Hutchins and Lucian Kahn of Visigoths and Morgoths, as well, and Plant Girl game designer Dominic Dickey, all of these people mentioned that. And Dom said specifically, I was curious what players would do with this game. And lastly, we had one more in this. Colossal, yes. Nick Angle said, I imagine other people telling their own stories within that world. And so we also can connect with a hypothetical future player of our game to gain that sort of inspiration to make something for that hypothetical person or towards that hypothetical person enjoying our game. And then the second motivating factor that we found was personal experience in the sense of self-reflection. So again, personal experience is always was one of the things we underscored in that first part, and it does recur in this section. And for 26% of designers, showing the same ingredients that led to that initial spark can often help nurture it into a flame. These included games like Make Our Own Heaven by Ray Cox and How to Say Goodbye by Aaron Lim. Those games had something intensely personal about them to the creators, and the experience of that and wanting to make it into the games still continued to motivate them as they were making that game. When it came to being inspired to do something, the relationship between the game and the self was more in focus. So it's not just, this thing happened to me, but like how does that self-reflection around it came to the forefront. I think for many people, making games is an exercise of self-reflection. I know for us that there's a lot of that in it, even if it's not conscious and it's on a subconscious level, but often consciously. And even when the games don't have anything to do with your personal experience on the surface, you're always going to be bringing something of yourself to that game. So it's, I guess in that way, being inspired to do something has a lot drawing on your own self-reflection. So in this one, we also had some examples. Kira McGrath, Something Is Wrong Here, started as an obsession with Twin Peaks and David Lynch. However, when working on the game, in Kira's own words, I peeled back the layers and found that the idea of doppelgangers and identity within David Lynch's work really pokes at some of my own core issues with the constant evolution of my trans identity, grappling with interpersonal relationships, how they often mirror our relationships with ourselves, and the real-time horror of currently living in the US. It was very specific, but that was unlike just being inspired to do that. That personal experience also is what was the driving factor towards making this idea into a game. Playing RPGs as an activity is something that often reflects on the self, and it's not surprising to see that also mirrored in the act of designing a role-playing game. Closeness to the self is very, very important, and especially in nurturing a game project through the development period. Okay, we need to speed up slightly. We had a lot to get through.
We dwelled too long on all these interesting games.
Yeah.
All right. So I do want to touch on the last two, even if we can't go into them as much as in depth. So the third source of inspiration we found was passion to bring a game into the world. So earlier in the section, we mentioned obsession and passion about the game's concept. This category of inspiration too is a little different. It's about the passion to bring this particular game into the world. So not just about creating the game, but about releasing the game, the purpose of the game in the wider world, and how it fits within the landscape of existing role-playing games. And this is something that fueled 32% of designers. So to break it down for a little more, 18% of all the designers had a desire to showcase a particular theme or idea. 12% wanted to provide a new experience or create a game that didn't exist yet. And then 2% came at it from a more product point of view, so had a vision for the game release. So just to touch on each of these quickly, the desire to showcase a theme or idea is about expressing something that's important to you as a designer. And this could be communicating about an important subject matter, such as in Tomorrow on Revelation 3, which raises questions about labor and society, and After the War, which is about people coming together to form a healthier community. And games could be used also as a vehicle to introduce people to a new kind of experience or concept. So in the case of Gentleman Bandit, designer Alison Arth wanted to open up the genre of poetry to folks who maybe had never written a poem or who might be intimidated by writing poems. And occasionally this passion to create a game connected with a frustration the designer had, either with the state of games or with the world. So with the game Wise Woman, Alexandra Brockman created it to showcase Polish folklore, but also to reflect the frustrations with the political developments currently occurring in Poland.
I see that one of the comments that we got was that a lot of people mentioned spite being a strong motivator. So yeah, spite and frustrations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huge, yeah.
So onto the 12% who wanted to create a type of gamer experience that didn't exist in the world of RPGs yet. Definitely the case with Thirsty Sword Lesbians. Designer April Kit Walsh couldn't find a game quite deliver the sword lesbian experience that she dreamed of. And similarly with Pit Crawler, MacGuffin & Co. said of their game that it filled a gap they really wanted. And of course, some designers did have that end product in mind. So with City of Winter, Ross Cowman, it contributed to his vision of 4 games in the Fall of Magic series, each focusing on a different season. So looking at the designs in this category, it shows us that it can be helpful to think about your why you want to make this game as one that is released into the world, and what you hope for from that release and your game's connection and impact on the wider world as well. And the last category is that the project is doable, the feeling of I can do that. So it's not surprising that the fact that a project feels doable is going to mean it's more likely to get done. What's more unexpected is that feeling like a project is doable is a source of motivation to pursue it in the first place. So for 22% of designers, the imagined ease of a project helped them to get started. So for example, for Kat Rahman, she saw that her project was realizable enough to take to a convention, while Sydney Icarus noted that the game was easy to prototype. And in 12% of cases, these designers were also bolstered by the idea of starting small or starting simple, even when the final version of the game turned out to be a lot more complicated than the initial concept. So longsword designer Vidica Voletti originally decided to make a game for his maps that he thought would keep things simple. However, then in Vidica's word, the gears started turning and one idea led to another and the game grew. And how often does this happen? We know this. But even feeling like there's something small you can do or something simple you can do to get going, the approachability of the idea and your ability to visualize the path forward with that idea, it's a really useful source of motivational energy. So even imagining the smallest version of your game can be a trick to motivate yourself forward, even if eventually you have a grand vision that will eclipse this early version. So quick conclusion.
Yep. That's where all these 50 game designers got their ideas and how they harness that inspiration to create a full game. Great. There's lots to learn from their experiences and approaches, along with all the insights we've mentioned about today. There's a few things that there's no right way to design a game. Everyone has a different process. But hold on to the things that resonate with you. The things you love will never lead you astray. Keep them close. These things that you love will be the most fertile ground for your next game. And ZXU, I want to end on this set of the inspiration for Lawn Song of the Bachelor. I guess I made something about it because it felt like home. So yes, we're gonna take questions now to the end of the hour.
1 minute per 30 seconds per question.
6 minutes of questions.
Okay. How do you cultivate your inspirational sparks? What do you recommend designers do to carry that inspired game all the way to completion? I think the big things that stick out from our talk today is to cultivate the obsession, cultivate the passion, immerse yourself in it. I mean, of course, sometimes you need breaks from a project.
Yeah.
But most of the time, we saw that, like, even if you're not directly engaging with a project, engaging with the aspects or the things that get you excited, like maybe if you're excited by a particular piece of media and you find yourself losing passion for a project, you need to go back and touch again on that spark, that thing that really keeps you motivated. I think that's a big part of it, as well as imagining and connecting with other people and imagining that reality of your game touching on people's hands. Do you have anything to add on that
Inspired
one?
game all the way to completion. Break it up into smaller, doable chunks was a good one. Imagine how it will like its impact on the world. How is it important to kind of like society, or things that you know, messages that you want to connect it to. Those are the big ones that we found, and getting people to be hyped about it through the early playtests. Find what's fun with it, with that idea for you and people around you.
Definitely. So the next question: do you find that the area of inspiration, whether it comes from media or life experience of a game, influences the standard or level of finish you hold yourself to? I don't feel like that was something that anyone mentioned in their responses. So we really can only speak to it from a personal perspective.
There was one. I think there was I remember Aaron's one. It was in love.
That's true, actually. That's a really good
The game
point.
was awkward. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. I don't have it up in front of me right this
messy.
moment. It was messy and awkward, but I loved. But it was based on something so close to me, and I loved it. And I loved the messiness of it in the end, because it reflected. I'm really paraphrasing. I'm sorry, Aaron, but I can find it later. But I think there is a sense that sometimes designers will feel. Yeah, and I guess
a game might take a particular format or have a particular feel about it because it has been inspired by a particular thing. I think more than a level of finish or a standard, it's more like the way in which it carries that idea or spark into fruition might be different, and what you want out of that might be different depending on what originally sparked the idea for the game in the first place.
Yeah, that's well put. That's kind of what I I did exactly.
Is there any other questions? I'm not sure. I think that might be the two that we got. Perfect. All right. So thanks for being with us today. I hope you got a lot out of this. If you're watching it after the fact and have the chance to go through the games more slowly, I highly recommend checking them out.
They're all really cool.
So we will be in the post-panel chat for a while if there's any further questions that come into mind. And as well as that, you can find our work at storybrewersroleplaying.com. You can find us on Twitter. I'm Storybrewers. And
Vee is Rocketeer
Vee. And really hope that you enjoy the rest of Big Bad Con online, because there's always tons of great panels that we're also very excited to get to watch. So.
Yeah, awesome. And one last thing about ideas. I just remembered it about cultivating the ideas as well, is just give yourself time to think, like to just not think of ideas, don't sit there being like, what ideas will I have, but like to have new experiences in life and stay curious. And that is super fun to do anyway.
That's true. It is super fun to do anyway.
Yeah. So I hope that this has helped you think about your own games and where you think about the whys of your own ideas. And good luck for getting through and completing a game.